Hello, my name is Narayan and I will be doing my academic shorts project on William Wilberforce. Now, William Wilberforce was a philanthropist, he was a politician, and he was an activist. He was a person who had laid foundations for further human rights. His influence is entwined in the very roots of the founding of Caterham School. He revolutionised the lives of millions across the globe and began a movement, he began a fight, and he began a protest that continues to this day. I will be presenting research that uncovers the full story of the great abolitionists that have changed society as we know it, to discover the story that billions of people through history are part of, and will be answering their question, who was William Wilberforce? Hull is a city in the East Riding of Yorkshire. It was here that Wilberforce was born in the year 1759. This is Wilberforce House, William's childhood home. The family were not wealthy, but well off. It was one of the most fashionable residences at the time. The old narrow roads of Hull today are quiet and normally rather deserted. In Wilberforce's time, it was a completely different scene. There were merchants, sailors, vendors, and people on their weekly errands rushing about. William could have easily heard talk of slavery when he was young. The house was described as a place full of family, laughter, and happiness in his childhood. But things changed. When he was 9, his father died. His mother faced financial issues and the boy was taken to live with his aunt and uncle. Wilberforce grew fond of them and even began to take an interest in religion before he was brought back to Hull. He even attended George Whitefield's preaching. Another man, born 3 years earlier than Wilberforce, was also attending these preachings, John Townsend, who would go on to found Caterham School. Wilberforce was sent to St John's College in Cambridge when he was 17, and he had been the recipient of inherited money from the wills of his relatives, and this allows him to live Cambridge life to the full, as was described in The Age. As a young man, he is described by his biographer William Hague as witty, generous, and an excellent conversationalist. Gradually, he became very popular. Another Cambridge student, Thomas Gisborne, lived in rooms next to Wilberforce's and describes him in his room with guests. Encircled by young men of talent, he even befriended William Pitt the Younger, who had become Prime Minister. He received a Bachelor and Master of Arts degree and entered the world as an enthusiastic young man entirely unaware of the following events that would change his life forever. The slave trade is a 3-worded phrase that describes the transportation of 12.8 million human beings from their home country to around the world to labour in plantations or even in households. The trade in flesh and blood was a term that Wilberforce and the abolitionists used. It presents the slave trade in its true form. It allowed thousands of people across the world to physically purchase a human life. The slave trade worked in a triangle. Ships were sent from Britain to Africa, where enslaved people were purchased. Then they were sent on a slave ship to America, commonly to plantations, where they had to work and labour. The goods they produced from the plantations were then sent over the sea back to Britain. Looking at the National Archives, records show that a ship arrived from Africa. When it left Africa, it carried 600 enslaved human beings. When it arrived in America, after 4 weeks, it carried 200 enslaved alive human beings. In a storm, the sickest enslaved people were thrown overboard to lighten the ship. In fact, in 1781, a slave ship called the Zong overthrew 130 enslaved people off the ship to claim insurance as it was overloaded. Insurance could be claimed on enslaved lives. People had become physical property to be dispensed with for profit. A plan of the ship, the Brooks, shares some more light on this. It tells us that the height of the berth compartment during the 4-week journey was 2 feet and 7 inches. That's 79 centimetres. Many died from starvation, disease, illness and childbirth in a place a little taller than 2 average-sized rulers. The slave trade was horrific, a terrifying, shocking reminder of an impervious stain on countries across the globe. We must remember these people in our history, our story. In the past, they have been forgotten. The lives of human beings were being physically sold to some people so they could build huge houses and come back to fill their coffers. We have to remember the millions of people as part of our story. That many places, buildings and institutions were built on the profits and connected with people who did this. Caterham School was co-founded by the person who stopped the trade in flesh and blood, William Wilberforce. In the October of 1784, Wilberforce embarked on a tour of Europe with his old schoolmaster, Isaac Milner, that would change his life forever. Milner was the best companion. Wilberforce was completely unaware of what would happen during that trip. Many people went on similar journeys known as the Grand Tour. It was a custom that had begun in the 1660s and had ended in the 1840s, when it had become less popular. It was a trip through Europe, seeing the famous landmarks and getting to discover different cultures. That was a question whether some Grand Tours were actually doing that or not. Sometimes people like Elgin plundered many items and brought them home, so it may have been explore the culture and bring a fair amount home with you. The Adam brothers of neoclassical fame received their inspiration when they returned from the Grand Tour. It was normally taken by the upper classes or the wealthy, as it was rather expensive. Roughly a year later, after embarking on the Grand Tour, in 1785, Wilberforce writes to announce that he experienced a classic conversion to Christian evangelism. Wilberforce was slap bang in the middle of the Age of Enlightenment, a revolutionary new collection of ideas and beliefs that would later help cause the French Revolution. Wilberforce's 20th century biographer wrote, "He was reading about an equal society while watching enslaved people pass the window." Maybe Wilberforce had an Isaac Newton moment, where an apple dropped on his head and he finally and suddenly realised that action needed to be taken to destroy the slave trade. Or perhaps it was a gradual process in which he saw, read and debated with Milner. A noticeable thing was that many people who went on the tour returned with something. Maybe plundered statues from the Parthenon, or even musical ideas or architectural inspiration. What Wilberforce returned with, however, was a mission. The mission to end slavery. Wilberforce had brought abolition to Parliament for the majority of his political career. The trade made up over 80% of the empire's foreign income. When Wilberforce brought this up, he was often challenged back with, "Without the slave trade, England's coffers would become lighter and lighter. The effect of even contemplating an abolition is entirely out of the question." The French Revolution broke out in 1789, and members of Parliament back in London had become scared that ideas would spread and form a revolt. Terrifying scenes such as the storming of the Bastille presented how quickly and effectively a system could be overthrown by the people, and how gruesome it could become with the guillotine. But the last petition had over 1.5 million signatures, from the average person to the landed gentry. But he kept on getting defeated. This reflects Caterham's first motto, Omnia vinces perseverando, we shall persevere. Lord Grenville had become Prime Minister after Pitt, and was determined to introduce a bill for the abolition to present to the House of Lords, as a change from the House of Commons. It was a clever move, a political method in getting a bill passed that had informed both houses of the upcoming presentation. With the new political method, the influence of the French Revolution, the 1.5 million people who had signed the petition, and simply the fact that humans were being enslaved, kidnapped from their country and being forced into labour, even if they could survive the horrific journey, the votes to the bill were as follows: 280 votes in favour of the abolition, 16 against the abolition. Wilberforce had tears streaming from his face. 2 decades of campaigning, millions of people who had been enslaved, and millions dead. The Slave Trade Act gained the royal assent on the 15th of March, 1807 by the King. Wilberforce and the abolitionists had done it. The slave trade had been abolished. William Wilberforce was an extraordinary, revolutionary figure who had changed society, politics and religious beliefs, opinions, thoughts, feelings and lives forever. Without the abolitionists, millions more would have died and would have become enslaved. It is our duty and essential task to remember and never forget the millions of people that were abducted from their home countries and forced into labour and work without choice on soil that wasn't their own. Now, more than ever, things are changing. There is an international community, and we need to learn each and individually how to respect others. Wilberforce and the great abolitionists were ahead of their time. They campaigned and spent their lives to stop the trade in flesh and blood. They were defeated countless times, but they believed, they understood they needed to return and persevere until what was right truly happened. You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know. Wilberforce's legacy lives on today, to persevere, to continue, and to never, ever give up, no matter what the circumstances. Veritas sine timor, truth without fear.